Hi guys, welcome to Tuesday lecture for U.S. history. There's a lot of stuff to cover in this chapter as we're looking at declaring independence. We looked yesterday at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the first battle of the Revolution, and now we're looking at declaring independence. There's a lot to cover. We're just going to hit the highlights in this lecture, so be sure to read the textbook carefully. As with any conflict, you're going to have division among the people, and that's what happened. That was what was going on in the colonies. They were British citizens. Most everyone in the colony was a British citizen, and so they were loyal to the king. They had loyalties to their homeland, just like you have loyalties to the United States of America. They had loyalties to the king and to Great Britain. But after all this was happening, you had a lot of them were patriots who thought that independence was the best route for the success of the nation, for the success of the colonies, and others who thought they could negotiate and have representatives in Parliament and that things would be okay. So the patriots and the loyalists are also called the Tories, because of the Tory party in England, who was supporters of the king. So you had this dispute. But the split was also evident over in Great Britain. There are a lot of people there that didn't want to fight against the colonists. It looked at it as fighting their own people. And so they opposed it also, to the extent that they couldn't get enough soldiers really to come and fight against the colonists. So the king was forced to hire Hessian mercenaries, who were professional soldiers from the province of Hesse in Germany. And so he hired a lot of these guys to come over. There were also politicians who opposed it. William Pitt, Edmund Burke, these guys. William Pitt himself said, "If I were an American, as I am an Englishman, while a foreign troop landed in my country, I would never lay down my arms. Never, never, never. You cannot conquer America." And of course, he proved to be prescient with that. So the Second Continental Congress meets. They were meeting primarily to work out some negotiations with the governance of the colonies. But now they realized this took place only a few weeks after Lexington and Concord, and so they had to do something about the battles. And so they appointed George Washington to be the head of the Continental Army. He was a natural choice. So he traveled from Philadelphia to Cambridge to take charge of the army, but before he could get there, the Battle of Bunker Hill took place. That battle was actually on a place called Breed's Hill, which was close to Bunker Hill. But the British commander, Thomas Gage, ordered a frontal assault on the entrenched patriots. He had to attack them 3 times, and the only reason they had to give ground was because they ran out of ammunition. And so Washington arrives to take command of the army, and it was kind of a standoff, but he decided to break the deadlock. He sent Henry Knox, a man, back to Fort Ticonderoga that had been captured from the British, and he got Knox to bring back 59 pieces of heavy artillery cannons. And the cannons arrived, and Washington drove the British out of Boston. They were forced to evacuate. From there, they went up to Canada and started reorganizing. But the people still didn't want to fight a war, so they sent what's called the Olive Branch Petition, which was a letter directly to the king, bypassing Parliament and appealing to the king, telling him that they were loyal to him, and they wanted him to step in and take measures to make things fair for them to live. They said, "We only have 2 choices. We can either submit to you or resist by force." But what happened is the king didn't even read that Olive Branch Petition. Instead, he issued his proclamation of rebellion, instructed his Boston army to treat the Americans as open and avowed enemies. And I got a little video to show you on a recreation of the reading of his response. But public opinion was solidified. I had you watch a video on Thomas Paine also in the Common Sense. That pamphlet was a tremendous factor in energizing the American colonies. Over 500,000 copies were sold. Washington himself said, "I find that Common Sense is working a powerful change in the minds of many men." So, summer and spring of 1776, one colony after another changed its constitution to a Republican form of government. On June 7th, a man named Richard Henry Lee presented a resolution saying that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. So Continental Congress heard that. They decided to act on that resolution, appointed a committee of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingstone, and Thomas Jefferson to draw up the Declaration On July 2nd, it was approved. On July 4th, the final draft of the Declaration of Independence was ready. And it was signed by 56 delegates who, while signing, knew it was an act of treason to sign that piece of paper, but they did it anyway. And I've got, in class tomorrow, I'll read you an interesting little excerpt about that. It's very interesting to think about the sacrifice those men made. So as the British Army sailed from Boston, they went to Canada, and then they turned their fleet toward New York City. Problem is, New York was not defensible for Washington. The East and the Hudson Rivers were on either side of it. There was a big harbor there. It would have been militarily wise just to abandon the city, but naturally you can't abandon one of the largest cities in your country. And so Washington prepared for the worst when General Howe, who was replacement of General Gage, landed his forces on Staten Island. And throughout 1776, from the summer to the late fall, it was loss after loss after loss for the colonials. Washington would even watch as his men just turned and ran without even firing a shot. And so it got to be kind of a desperate situation. Came down in the winter of 1776. Most of Washington's army had signed on for 6 months enlistments. After the Declaration, they were all fired up, so they signed up for these enlistments that were going to expire on December 31st, and Washington was set to lose a lot of his men. What would happen is, when their enlistment was up, they would just walk on home. It was over. They didn't have to do any paperwork or anything. And so he knew they were facing that. A lot of people were now more and more leaning toward the loyalist side, leaning toward the king. And so Washington knew he had to do something drastic. So he comes up with this plan to attack a Hessian garrison located at Trenton, New Jersey. As they had been forced to leave New York, they were on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. And Washington made the decision to attack Trenton, along with a couple of other forces that would come in from different angles. He had to row across the Delaware River, and his plan was to do it on Christmas night, 1776. And he was supposed to arrive and be ready to attack at dawn. Well, he had some delays. And so he got ready to go, and again, it was a garrison of Hessian soldiers that were there. Remember, the mercenaries. Well, one of those guys there in that garrison was a young man named Caspar Cable. He was born about 1756, so he was about 20 years old at the time. And when he was 16, over in Hanover, Germany, which is in the province of Hesse, his father had chosen a 30-year-old widow for him to marry. Well, she kind of had a facial deformity. She wasn't very good looking. He didn't want to marry her. And so he ran off and joined the army. He joined Colonel Johann Rahl's Hessian troops. And so those troops were trained, and then they shipped off to the colonies. And he was stationed at Trenton, New Jersey on that Christmas night, 1776. What's interesting about Caspar Cable is he happens to be my fifth great-grandfather. And so he was there that night. And of course, Christmas night, they're Hessian soldiers, they are mercenaries, they don't have any real personal interest in the war, they're monetary interest, so they're having a party on Christmas Day. It's also really cold. Washington's trying to get across the river, there's ice chunks floating down the river. He makes it across, they have to march through the snow, 2 men die of exposure on the way to get to Trenton. Finally, they get there about 8 o'clock in the morning. But nobody expected them to come in such bad weather. So they attack. The Hessians are caught completely by surprise. Colonel Rahl surrenders without really the loss of a single man. And there was 2 Hessians killed. Nearly 1,000 were captured. And only a couple of the Continentals were even wounded. It's interesting, a couple of those. One was James Mason and James Madison, 2 future presidents, were part of this expedition that went across. Washington didn't lose a single man. And so it's a huge victory. Washington moves from there to Princeton, where General Cornwallis has a thinly defended base. So he attacks there, and he has a victory at Princeton. even though they were disorganized. Washington himself goes to the front and directs the battle. But these were really minor affairs, more raids than battles. They weren't huge deals, but the effect on American morale was huge. Those soldiers re-enlisted. More and more soldiers joined up, and so the army increased. But the British had launched a plan to win the war. A force under General Burgoyne in Canada moved down through upstate New York, trying to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. But Howe didn't cooperate. He wanted to attack Philadelphia. That did embarrass America initially, but in the long run, it didn't work out. Instead of marching across New Jersey to Philadelphia, the British sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, and Washington placed the Continental Army at Brandywine Creek to await the enemy. So at the Battle of Brandywine, Howe outmaneuvered Washington. Washington had to fall back, and the British entered Philadelphia unopposed on September 26, 1777. And Washington tried to retake it, but the attack failed, and the American capital was in enemy hands. Congress had to flee for their lives. While Howe was getting ready to attack Philadelphia, General Burgoyne was marching down Lake Champlain, and the orders to Howe were unclear. Howe's decision to attack Philadelphia meant that there was only a token force to move on the Hudson River. And so British force moved from Lake Ontario to help Burgoyne, but were driven off by Benedict Arnold's fleet. Following these setbacks, several defeats inflicted on Burgoyne's force caused problems. A troop of Hessians went to capture American supplies. They were ambushed and nearly destroyed. Then in two separate battles in Saratoga, New York, the Americans dealt heavy blows to the British. The American commander was General Horatio Gates, who received much of the glory, but the real credit belonged to his subordinates who led the fighting, which was Daniel Morgan and Benedict Arnold. After the second battle, the British attempted to withdraw, but the Americans overtook them and surrounded them, and October 7th, Burgoyne surrendered to Gates. This is the turning point of the war. Significant to know, because what this did was show the French, who were impressed by the victory, that they then recognized the United States as a nation and joined in the war against them. But word of this alliance didn't reach America until the spring of 1778, but this was after the winter of 1777. With the British in Philadelphia enjoying the good life, Washington's army was at a place called Valley Forge. Washington had arranged Valley Forge, had arranged with the Continental Congress to have stores of supplies set up there, in place there, building materials to build cabins and things like that. None of that was there. They arrived. Few men had whole uniforms. Even fewer had shoes. Washington observed that they could have tracked the army from White Marsh to Valley Forge by the blood of their feet. Now, they had only Continental money to buy supplies, so the farmers in the area were selling to the British, who had gold to purchase things with. And so, 1778, a man named Frederick Baron von Steuben came to Valley Forge to help them train. Along with Alexander Hamilton, they trained the men, drilled the men to fight in the British way, fight properly, how to move in battle, and he transformed this disorganized bunch of guys into a fighting force. The French alliance created panic. Once the French announced that they were going to join up with the Americans, it created panic, and the British had to focus their attention. So later on, in 1778, on June 18th, a segment of the American army went to strike the rear of the British army. But Washington entrusted the initial attack to Charles Lee, who had little confidence in the quality of American soldiers, and he didn't do a very good job. And so, after a good start, the attack faltered, whereafter Lee ordered a retreat. But Washington brushed him aside and led his men to meet the attack. It was over 100 degrees, but the Battle of Monmouth vindicated Steuben's work, and the Americans were able to repulse the British attacks. Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow.